It started with a drawer she hadn't opened in years. Patricia was just looking for a spool of thread, something small to repair the fraying edge of a curtain in the guest room. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind where the world moved slowly and the wind hummed soft against the windows. Retirement had made her days blur together in a peaceful, if somewhat repetitive rhythm. She pulled the drawer open and began rummaging. Old notebooks, dried-out pens, a dusty compass from her teaching days. And then, tucked beneath a stack of faded postcards, she found a black folder, thin, sleek, unfamiliar. Her fingers paused. She wasn't one to snoop. 40 years of marriage had taught her that secrets, if kept, were usually harmless or forgotten. But something about the weight of the folder made her breath catch. She opened it. Inside were plane tickets. Not one or two. Dozens. Tokyo, Istanbul, Buenos Aires, Nairobi, Athens, Reykjavik. The dates were spread over 6 months, beginning in just 5 weeks. Patricia blinked. She found copies of hotel bookings, rail passes, even a medical travel insurance policy with both their names, and at the very bottom a note written in Mark's familiar handwriting. For us. One last adventure. Her hands trembled slightly. What was this? Her husband, Mark, quiet, practical, reliable Mark, was planning to leave or take her with him. And if it was a surprise, why hadn't he said anything? She felt the floor shift beneath her, metaphorically at first, then literally as she sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, folders still in her lap. They had spoken about traveling when they were younger, back when she was still a teacher, and he was still building his small business. They'd dreamed up maps on napkins and circled places in guidebooks that collected dust. But then life happened. Parents needed care. Children needed tuition. Careers stretched longer than planned. And eventually, the dreams became background noise. Now here it was again, pulled from the shadows like a ghost. That evening, Mark came home from the hardware store, whistling softly, a bag of nails in one hand and a new set of light bulbs in the other. Patricia watched him from across the room. His face was lined deeper now, but the same softness lived in his eyes. She waited until after dinner. When the plates were cleared and the coffee was poured, she reached into her sweater pocket and slid the folder across the table. Mark stared at it for a beat, then looked up. You found it, he said. Not exactly well hidden, she replied, voice calm but tight. He sighed, ran a hand through his graying hair and leaned back. I was going to tell you. Just not yet. When exactly? When we were boarding the plane? Maybe, he said with a weak smile. She didn't return it. Mark, she said, steady and low, what is this? He took a long breath. It's not what you think. Then help me understand. But he hesitated, and in that hesitation, Patricia felt something stir in her chest. A knot, something old, something that said, maybe he's hiding more than you think. That night, as he slept beside her, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the rhythm of his breathing. Outside, wind swept through the trees like a whisper. Inside, the woman who once dreamed of tracing the world with him now lay wondering whether the man beside her was planning to go without her. And why? She didn't sleep. Not really. Because the question kept ringing in her mind like a faraway bell. Was this a dream being resurrected? Or a goodbye dressed in adventure? The next morning, Patricia watched Mark move around the kitchen like nothing had happened. He poured the coffee, toasted the bread, hummed that same off-key tune he'd always hummed when spreading butter. Everything about him felt normal. And that, more than anything, set her on edge. She sat at the kitchen island, hands wrapped around her mug. Her eyes didn't leave him. You're really not going to explain? She asked, finally breaking the silence. Mark paused mid-spread, knife hovering over toast. I told you, it's something I was planning, for both of us. And yet, you never said a word. Not once. Not even when I talked about renewing the garden for spring or repainting the hallway. His shoulders dropped slightly. He set the knife down and turned to face her fully. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to say no. She blinked. Excuse me? I knew if I mentioned it too soon, you'd start thinking of all the reasons we couldn't do it. The house, the bills, the what-ifs. You'd overthink it to death before we even got to pack. Patricia stared at him, heat rising in her chest. You don't get to make that decision for me. I wasn't trying to make a decision without you, he said gently. I was trying to make space for a decision with you, without fear cutting it down before it even had a chance. She stood, moving to the sink, arms crossed tightly. You say this is for us, but it feels like it's already yours. There was a pause, a long one. Then Mark spoke, quieter this time. You know how many times you've said someday? She looked over her shoulder. I've lost count, he continued. Someday we'll go to Japan. Someday we'll see the northern lights. Someday we'll just sit on a beach and forget what year it is. But someday has become 30 years of standing still, Patricia. I didn't want to wait for another funeral or another health scare to remind us how little time we really have. His voice cracked at the end just a little. Patricia turned fully to face him now. She didn't respond right away. Her mind was racing with arguments she no longer fully believed. It was true, she had said someday more times than she could remember, and every time Mark had nodded, waited, and kept working quietly to make those dreams more than just words. But still, 6 months? Around the world? It's too much, she whispered. Too big. I haven't planned for any of this. I don't even know if I have the energy to be that person again. Mark stepped closer, slowly, as if approaching a startled bird. You don't have to be anyone except who you are right now. That's who I planned this for. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth hiding behind his steady tone. He was scared she'd say no, scared this would be the last window they'd have to live like they once dreamed. And deep down, Patricia felt something stir that she hadn't felt in years. Desire, not just for travel or excitement, but for a life that wasn't measured in routines and safe decisions. For spontaneity, for color, for that version of herself she'd packed away with her lesson plans and her passport. Still, she needed space. I need to think, she said finally. Mark nodded. Take all the time you need. She didn't say anything else. She slipped on her shoes and walked outside, down the familiar gravel path to the bench by the garden. The air was crisp. Birds were singing, stubborn against the chill. She sat, staring out at the lawn they'd trimmed for decades, the porch they'd repainted 5 times, the rhythm of a life she had built and protected. And for the first time in years, she wondered, had she built a life? Or had she built a comfortable cage? And if this really was the last chance to fly, was she ready to spread her wings again? Or had she forgotten how? The garden bench had always been her thinking place. It was where she sat after her mother died, where she read through her retirement papers the day she left the classroom for good, where she'd watched the seasons change like clockwork, each bloom and falling leaf reassuring her that life still had its order, even when she felt unmoored. But that morning, everything felt different. Patricia sat there for over an hour, staring at the same yard she had tended with quiet pride for decades. She had memorized every rosebush, every crack in the path, every tree that leaned just slightly too far in the wind. This was her sanctuary, her safety net, and yet it didn't feel like home. It felt like a story she'd already read, cover to cover, 1,000 times. When she finally stood up and went back inside, the house felt too still. Mark wasn't in the kitchen, not on the porch. She found him in the study, sitting on the floor, papers and maps spread out in front of him. He looked up, surprised but calm. I didn't mean to push, he said quickly. She held up a hand. Stop, please. Mark waited. Patricia stepped into the room and slowly sank into the armchair. Her voice was soft but clear. Tell me everything. And so he did. He showed her the full itinerary, how he'd chosen places they'd once circled on dog-eared maps in college, how he'd budgeted carefully for over 2 years, stashing away extra money from consulting work and cutting corners without her noticing, how he'd coordinated the logistics with travel agents who specialized in trips for older couples. He had even scheduled regular check-ins with their doctor along the way. Every piece had been planned, every obstacle pre-considered, every detail for her. Patricia said nothing for a long time. Then she reached out, pulling from the edge of the pile of folded paper, yellowed and cracked. It was a map, old, annotated in her own handwriting. Little stars and notes like, our first sunset here, and learn how to say thank you in 5 languages. She hadn't seen it in over 30 years. Tears blurred her vision. You kept this? Mark gave a quiet smile. Of course I did. You made me believe we'd go. Even when life got in the way, I never stopped hoping. Patricia pressed the map to her chest. The weight of the moment settled around them, not heavy with regret, but full of something else. Possibility. I don't know if I can do it, she whispered. 6 months? It sounds impossible. Mark leaned forward. It only has to be what you want it to be. We can shorten it, choose fewer places, take breaks. There's no rulebook. This is our story. She looked at him, at the man who, even in his 60s, still carried the boyish hope of a 20-year-old dreamer. And something inside her cracked open, something soft and warm that had been buried under decades of practicality. "Why now?" she asked. His voice was steady, but his eyes were glassy. "Because some day has waited long enough, and I want to go with you before we run out of chances." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she picked up a pen from the floor and slowly traced a small circle on the map, right over a tiny island off the coast of Greece. Mark raised an eyebrow. "You always said we'd dance barefoot on a rooftop there," she said, a smile forming through her tears. His breath caught. "Does that mean?" "It means," she interrupted, "you better have packed my sandals." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stood, crossed the room, and wrapped his arms around her like he hadn't in years, not just with affection, but with purpose. They held each other in silence, the map crinkled between them, their foreheads pressed together like two explorers rediscovering the compass of their youth. And in that embrace, Patricia didn't feel 57. She felt like the girl who had once dreamed of the world, and for the first time in a long time, she was ready to meet it. The house buzzed with a quiet energy in the days that followed, like a storm about to break. But this time, it wasn't chaos on the horizon. It was adventure. Patricia began sorting through old clothes, searching for items that hadn't seen sunlight in years. A light windbreaker from their Yosemite trip. The teal scarf she bought in Montreal and swore she'd wear again someday. Even her travel journal, still half empty, tucked in the back of a drawer with pages yellowed by time. She opened it. On the first page, in her younger handwriting, was a list titled, "Before We're Too Old." Ride a hot air balloon, watch the stars from a desert, get lost on purpose, dance in the rain, fall in love again. She stared at it for a long time, then turned to a fresh page and wrote, "Maybe we're not too old after all." Mark, meanwhile, handled logistics, canceled the lawn care service, suspended utilities, gave their neighbor a key in case of emergencies. The more they prepared, the more real it became. And yet, even as the date drew near, Patricia found herself hesitating. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, heart thudding with questions she didn't want to speak out loud. What if she got sick halfway through? What if she hated it? What if she lost control of something here and couldn't get it back? She voiced some of it to her daughter, Elise, over coffee. "It's a beautiful plan, Mom," Elise said gently, "but it's okay to be scared." Patricia nodded. "I don't feel brave. I feel reckless." Elise smiled. "Maybe brave is just reckless with better intentions." They laughed. Then Elise reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "You've spent your whole life building a world for other people. Maybe it's time you live inside one you didn't plan." That night, Patricia walked out to the garden bench again. The same spot where doubt had first crept in. She sat there, watching the stars blink alive one by one. The wind carried the faint scent of lavender. Crickets chirped. Life went on, steady and predictable. And she realized predictability was exactly what she was afraid of now. When she came back inside, Mark was packing in the living room, rolling up socks, organizing tiny bottles into clear plastic bags. He looked up, smiling as she entered. "Any second thoughts?" he asked. She walked over, took the small pile of folded clothes in his hands, and began placing them neatly into the open suitcase. "No," she said. "Only second chances." He froze for a moment, watching her, then chuckled. "I hope you know I don't have a perfect plan for this." "I hope you know I don't need one," she replied. The morning of departure, they stood side by side at the airport gate, holding hands like newlyweds. Their suitcases were modest, their passports newly stamped, and their eyes, tired but alive, reflected the kind of hope most people lose long before 57. As they boarded the plane, Patricia turned to Mark. "You know," she said, "I still don't know where half these places on the itinerary are." "That's the best part," he grinned. "Now you get to teach me again." She laughed softly, leaning into him as the engines roared to life. For the first time in decades, she had no plan. And it felt like freedom. They lifted off into the sky, into the unknown, into the version of themselves they had almost forgotten. And the world, vast, wild, beautiful, was waiting. They landed in Kyoto at dawn. The sky was a soft watercolor of pink and gray, temples silhouetted against the hills, mist curling through quiet alleyways. Patricia stepped off the train and immediately felt it, the shift. The air smelled different. The pace of life moved to an unfamiliar rhythm. She wasn't in her garden anymore, and she didn't miss it. Mark handed her a small paper map with cherry blossoms drawn on the corners. Our ryokan's 2 streets down. Want to get lost first? She grinned. Absolutely. They wandered aimlessly, stopping for matcha at a tiny corner cafe where no one spoke English, and Patricia had to point at a photo menu with hesitant confidence. They took photos under the sakura trees, laughing as petals landed in their hair. At one point, she caught her reflection in a shop window. Messy hair, bright eyes, scarf tied crooked, and didn't recognize the woman staring back. But she liked her. In the following weeks, they crossed time zones like old pros. In Santorini, they fought. It was bound to happen. They were tired. The heat was unbearable. Patricia wanted to sit by the water and do nothing. Mark wanted to hike to the ancient ruins. They snapped at each other in the middle of a winding cobblestone street. "You're acting like this is a mission," she hissed. "Not an experience. And you're acting like you didn't want this," he snapped back. They stormed off in opposite directions, only to meet again hours later, sheepish and sunburned, in the courtyard of their hotel. Mark offered her a glass of wine. She accepted. "I'm not 25 anymore," she said after a long sip, "and I don't need to see every damn monument to feel like I've lived." He smiled. "Then let's stay here tomorrow. Sleep in, watch the waves." She looked at him, and maybe dance on a rooftop, at midnight under the stars. They did. No music, no witnesses. Just 2 souls moving quietly through a night that felt like a gift. In Kenya, they rode in a hot air balloon over the Masai Mara. Patricia had nearly backed out that morning. The height, the thought of floating over lions, the fear that something might go wrong. But Mark held her hand and said, "Let's be scared together." As the balloon lifted, Patricia closed her eyes, then opened them, and gasped. The sunrise spilled across the savannah like melted gold. Herds of animals moved below them, dots in a living painting. The wind whispered in her ears. She didn't feel scared anymore. She felt infinite. In Peru, she cried, not because of exhaustion or frustration, but because halfway up the stone path to Machu Picchu, her knees gave out. She sat down on a boulder, breath heaving, legs trembling, and said, "I can't." Mark crouched beside her, sweat pouring from his brow. "We can turn around," he said gently. "No," she whispered, angry at herself. "Just give me a minute." And then another, and another. Until finally, slowly they walked the last stretch together. At the top, standing before the ancient citadel, Patricia cried again. Not from pain, from pride. And in Paris, it rained. She stood on the Pont Neuf bridge, drenched and laughing, her shoes squishing with every step. Mark spun her under the drizzle, kissed her beneath the cloudy sky, and whispered, "We never needed a perfect view. Just a moment like this." She believed him, because somewhere between cherry blossoms and desert stars, rooftop dances and breathless climbs, Patricia had found something she didn't even know she'd lost. Not just the thrill of travel, not just the spark in her marriage. She had found herself, the brave version, the barefoot version, the woman who wrote "Get Lost on Purpose" in a travel journal and finally knew what it meant. 6 countries, 47 days, one love rediscovered. They came home to quiet, not the dull, empty kind, but a soft, grounding hush. The house welcomed them like an old friend, familiar yet somehow changed. Or maybe it was them who had changed. The photos on the walls, the books on the shelves, the ticking of the kitchen clock, they were all still there. But Patricia saw them with new eyes. She unpacked slowly. Not just the suitcases, but the months of memories, the emotional souvenirs. Sand still clung to the hems of her pants. A napkin from the cafe in Kyoto had found its way into her journal. There was a small seashell from Greece in the pocket of her coat, and pressed between pages of a travel brochure was the receipt from the balloon ride in Kenya. Each item whispered, "You did it. You lived it." Mark returned to his small home office, sorting through unopened mail, waving politely to neighbors. Patricia found herself gravitating to her old writing desk, the one she hadn't touched in years. She opened her journal, the same one she had once filled with hopes and empty lines. Now it was full. And still, she kept writing. Not about places, but about what the places had revealed. about fear and courage, regret and forgiveness, and how love, real love, wasn't fireworks or drama. It was carrying each other's bags when you're too tired. It was holding hands when your knees hurt. It was laughing under leaky roofs in foreign cities and remembering why you fell in love in the first place. One evening, Patricia sat on the porch with Mark, sipping tea as the sun sank below the trees. "Do you regret coming back?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "No, because we didn't come back the same." He reached for her hand, calloused and sun-kissed from months on the road. "I'm proud of you," she smiled. "I'm proud of us." A few weeks later, Patricia published an essay online, "Falling in Love at 57, with the World and with Myself." It spread quietly but steadily. Women from across the country began to write to her, some in their 50s, some in their 70s, sharing stories of forgotten dreams and what they still hope to find. The essay turned into a blog. The blog became a small community, and suddenly, Patricia was not just a traveler, but a guide for others like her who were tired of waiting for someday. She and Mark hosted a workshop at the local library, Late Bloomers, How to Travel After 50. They expected 10 people. 60 showed up. As Patricia stood at the front of the room, sharing how she once thought her time had passed, how she almost said no to everything that changed her life, she felt something deeper than pride. She felt purpose. And when she looked over at Mark, smiling at her from the front row, eyes still filled with that same quiet, steady love, she knew this was the real destination. Not a mountaintop, not a famous city, but here, a life rebuilt with intention, a marriage reborn through adventure, and a woman once afraid to take the first step, now leading the way. Because in the end, Patricia hadn't just gone around the world, she had come home to herself. This story reminds us that it's never too late to say yes to adventure, to love, and to ourselves. It shows how rediscovering a shared dream can reignite not just a relationship, but the parts of us we thought were lost to time. What about you? Did this story move you? Share your thoughts in the comments. Type 2 if you enjoyed it, or 7 if it didn't quite connect. And if you'd like to hear more powerful, emotional stories like this one, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to EN Reddit's story. Your support helps keep these stories alive.